Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And we're so excited to present this show this week. It's the first of 4 planned conversations with Professor Joseph Ellis about the Jefferson-Adams correspondence. And it was a great conversation. You will not be disappointed listening to Clay and Professor Ellis.
Jefferson lived to be 83 years old, John Adams 91. Of all of the periods of their lives, the one I think that's richest, at least in terms of their friendship, is the period between 1812 and 1826 when they exchanged about 150 letters. Adams wrote 2 essentially for every one by Thomas Jefferson. But you learn more about the nature of the revolution and this extraordinary friendship between these 2 men during this period. And it's also a kind of reviewing of their lives. They both knew that they were approaching the end. And as Adams said, we must not die till we have explained ourselves to each other. I find that just exceedingly moving as a thought. They didn't actually fully succeed in that, but they made a good run at trying to, each of them, explain his philosophical and political point of view to a skeptic at the other end of America.
You know, it's really fascinating to read these letters. I would encourage listeners, if they're interested, to get a copy of the book that we talk about. And you, sir, were so kind as to give me a copy of it years ago. And it is dog-eared and well-read. But these 2 men, they bounce between these serious discussions about what democracy means. We didn't even touch on their exchanges about religion, but they're also they're almost playful at time, and they're both very sentimental about their relationship during the Revolution.
Well, Jefferson called them a band of brothers, and he really measured his life from 1775. That was when he became a national figure. That's when he met the other great worthies of the early national period, including John Adams. And he and John Adams were as close as 2 political collaborators could be for a relatively long period. And then things broke down. But when Jefferson looked back from old age at this, he thought, and I think he was right, that the great moment of his life was then when the revolutionaries of America were in union. They agreed with each other about our need to separate from Great Britain, and this crisis brought everyone into kind of a unified worldview and a peak experience that was never going to be equaled, even by being the president of the United States for 8 years, even by purchasing Louisiana Territory, even by founding the University of Virginia. And so, as you say, there's a deep sentiment of love and bewilderment and hurt and hope that occurs in this extraordinary correspondence between 1812 and 1826.
Yes, as Adams says, we must understand ourselves before we die. We are recording this in the midst of the pandemic. As most of you know, we're working remotely. It's been a challenge, but it's working out, and it's much better to do it than not. We've gotten so many kind letters from folks who have encouraged us to keep on doing the show. We fully intend to. It's been a long while since we've missed a week, and we intend to keep it that way. Having said all that, I know this is affecting you tremendously, Clay. Well, it's affecting all of us tremendously. And again, I really want to take a moment just to thank all those people that have bravely continued their work, and I'm talking about the postman and the delivery people for UPS and FedEx and those who stock our grocery shelves, the sanitation workers, all of those folks who are on the front line, especially the first responders, the medical personnel. I have so much respect and gratitude for those folks. And we will continue to do the show, which is a small thing compared to all of those folks. I know it's affected your schedule, Clay. You can't go out and do your appearances and your performance, but you do have a few things coming up, and now's the time to tell listeners about that.
Well, I'm doing online courses. People can find out more about them at jeffersonhour.com. One of them is on pandemics in history and literature, and the longer one that's more in the true spirit of Jefferson is an 8-part online course on the Enlightenment. So you can pre-sign up And if you can't find information on the site, this is all happening pretty fast. You certainly can write to me through jeffersonhour.com, and I'll give you the details. But I'm actually having the time of my life. My daughter's here. Everyone asks about her. She got back from Oxford. She's doing her work on her Oxford doctorate from the basement in this house in Bismarck, North Dakota. Yesterday, we tried to make masks. We were hand sewing masks.
Good for you.
And
That's great.
they look like kites. They look like handkerchiefs that were made under a really bad early industrial revolution, but we're doing our best. We're getting better at them. We're still waiting for elastic. Who would have ever thought that we'd be begging for elastic from different companies?
Rubber bands,
Amazon.com. But we're having fun. We're reading books. We're talking. We're taking walks. I'm looking out my window, and the cottonwoods are budding. It snowed this morning here in Dakota du Nord. It's a strange time. I haven't been in my own house this many nights for many years, but I'm finding it to be a very productive period. And as long as we can continue to do the Thomas Jefferson Hour, I'm happy.
I agree. And I also think that this unusual time we're living in, it provides us all with a lot of what I would call me time. It gives us a chance to sort of reflect on what really is important and what we can do without that we used to take for granted. Personally, I had a great day yesterday. I spent the day transplanting tomatoes, reading, and listening to obscure vinyl LPs I'd forgotten I owned.
Well, just to be clear here, we're recording this on Jefferson's birthday on the 13th of April. You didn't plant those tomatoes outside yesterday.
No, transplanted them,
I've been getting these photographs from our friend Pat Brodowski at Monticello showing green things growing in every direction.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to send her a picture from this morning of the blizzard in Bismarck, North Dakota.
Yeah. Well, with that, we should probably go to the show. Again, the first of 4 planned conversations with Professor Joseph Ellis, the Jefferson-Adams letters.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, where we talk all things Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and here with me is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and we're also joined by a very special guest, Professor Joseph Ellis. But Clay, you wanted to talk about what today is.
Yes, we're recording this as a series of pandemic conversations with the great Joseph Ellis, author of a whole range of tremendous books on the early national period, including 2 of my favorites, Passionate Sage, the character of John Adams, whom Joe Ellis understands, I think, better than any other human being, and then American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, which is a kind of a companion book. And I love that book, The Character of Jefferson, because it's a playful, at times irreverent look at the way Jefferson was able to wall off different parts of his outlook and even his personality from each other. And that might sound like self-delusion, but in fact, it's a really interesting paradox at the heart of Jefferson's way of seeing. So first of all, thanks to you, Joseph Ellis, for being a guest again on this program.
Always great to talk with you. And it's especially great in this quarantine phase of our lives. And when we're, quote, alone together, a paradox that Jefferson would have fully appreciated. And we're capable of self-government, which is his ideal, and being alone, but also recognizing we're part of some whole, a collective. And so I haven't been able to talk to anybody else for weeks, and so I'm thrilled to be able to do so now.
Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13th, New Style, in the year 1743, actually April 2nd, Old Style. There was a whole shift of the calendar early in Jefferson's life, but his birthday is celebrated on April 13th, and today is that day. And of course, as you know, Joseph Ellis, Jefferson and Adams died simultaneously, more or less, on the 4th of July, 1826.
Yeah, I mean, no novelist could have made that up and sold the book to a publisher because it's too impossible to imagine. And when Benjamin Rush first brings them together, and we'll talk about why it's been so difficult to get them together, in 1813, 2 former presidents, he says, I have a vision of you recovering your friendship and then ascending into heaven on the same day or the same time. And that's exactly what happens. On July 4th, 1826, Jefferson dies about 12:20 in the afternoon, and Adams dies a little after 5 in the evening. And Adams's last words are, "Thomas Jefferson still lives," which in some sense he does. More so than
Technically
Adams.
untrue, but true in a larger sense. So here's my first question, since you brought that up. They're near simultaneous deaths on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, prognosticated in a certain way by their mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush. What's the tone of that last statement by Adams on his deathbed? Jefferson still survives. Is it a sense of wonder? Is it a sense of celebration? Is it envious? How do you read it?
They had conversations during the correspondence about who was going to be the last of the founding generation to survive. And Adams said, "It's not going to be me because I'm older than you are, and you're the youngest, and therefore I fully expect you to be the last." And like someone closing up the house at the end of an evening before going to bed, I expect you to rake the ashes onto the fire and be the end of our generation in that sort of solemn act.
Let's back up. They met each other in 1775 in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress. They became close allies and in many respects good friends. They served together in Europe while Jefferson was effectively the ambassador to France and John Adams was the ambassador to the court of St. James in England. They shared a lot of time in Paris, and later John Adams said that John Quincy Adams, his son, was in a sense almost Jefferson's child because Jefferson served as a mentor to him during those really important years between 1784 and 1789. And then came the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was divisive, and it really rocked the founding generation, and people essentially wound up on one side or the other, those who deplored it as a nightmare of anarchy and bloodshed and madness, and those who, at varying levels of warmth, accepted it as a necessary bloodletting. And Jefferson comes down on the side of those who supported the French Revolution, even when it turned into the terror, and Adams was one who early on was appalled by what he saw coming and only confirmed by the chaos which the French Revolution produced. So at that point, Jefferson and Adams start to be very wary of each other. And when they are in contest for the presidency in 1800, this shatters the friendship. And it's not even clear that they will ever be able to work it out. They last see each other in the first days of March 1801 when Adams is leaving Washington and Jefferson is taking his place as the third president. There's a kind of a stiff farewell. Adams goes back to Quincy, Massachusetts, to Braintree. Jefferson spends his 2 terms and then retires to Monticello. And it looks, Joe, like at that point, these 2 great patriarchs who were once close friends are never going to be able to reconcile.
Good summary. I'll just amplify it slightly. In the 1790s, in large part because of the party split that occurs, to talk about political parties is a little presentistic. They didn't exist as parties, but 2 factions. One called the Federalists, which was Washington and Hamilton and Adams's persuasion. The other was called Republicans. The textbooks often, American history textbooks, are wrong about this. They refer to them as Democratic Republicans. That is not a term that gets used until 1816. The term democracy has in the post-revolutionary era is still an epithet. It means mobocracy. And but remember, they run against each other twice. First in 1796, when Adams wins by a narrow margin, and then in 1800, when Jefferson wins by a slightly larger but still narrow margin. So they are, opponents at the presidential level twice, and part of the hostility that the Adams family, that includes Abigail, feels towards Jefferson is that he hired certain journalists to demean Jefferson, to demean Adams, and include John Quincy. And the threat was if Adams was reelected in 1800, he would appoint John Quincy to be his successor and establish a monarchy, all kinds of stuff. So that both Abigail and John felt hostility to Jefferson. Jefferson felt some hostility towards Adams because one of his last acts was to appoint John Marshall and a series of other federal judges to the federal courts in Marshall as Chief Justice. This was after he had already lost the election, before Jefferson took power. Remember, the election occurred then, as it does now, in November, but the inauguration and then didn't occur until April, not January as it is now. And there was a much longer period of time. At any rate, I'm just amplifying the background that Clay's already given you about their friendship and their parting of the ways.
Well, let me ask you a question about the 1796 campaign. Adams regarded himself, as he put it in a letter to his wife, as the heir apparent. He said that with some irony, but he was the most logical person to come next after the retirement of George Washington. In 1796, Jefferson claimed that he did not want to be president, that he was quite happy not to be involved at all, but if he won the vice presidency, that was preferable because it would give him long summers at Monticello and philosophic evenings in Philadelphia. Do you accept Jefferson's sense that he was not politically ambitious at that point, not wishing to be the second president?
Yes, I do. I mean, he's a tricky guy, and Adams himself said, he said, Jefferson, like all the other Virginia geese, and he always said that, or Virginia swans, that in Virginia all the geese were swans, and they concealed from themselves their true motives, and that it was now becoming almost mandatory for all people with great ambition to retire. And in that sense, he was saying that he thought Jefferson wasn't being sincere in his claim he didn't wish power. But I think he was sincere. And Madison even said, his closest friend down in Virginia, living not far away, that he didn't want to go visit Jefferson at Monticello during the time the election was occurring because Jefferson had let it be known he didn't want to know anything about it, didn't want to hear about it, and didn't want to know if it was on the ballot. I mean, one thing that this makes dramatically clear is how different it was back then. It was considered inappropriate to campaign. It was considered inappropriate even be interested in the office. It was considered a sign of ambition, and therefore anybody that claimed they really wanted to be president was automatically disqualified.
They were all posing as Cincinnatists, that they really would wanted to be home on their farm, and that they had no ambition, and that yes, if they were called by their countrymen, they would reluctantly. So Jefferson is the past master at this. George Washington plays this game too. They all do, but John Adams did admit that he very much wanted to be president. Once
the election had occurred and they were waiting on the electoral votes, he said, if I win, I'll serve, but I will not serve if I come in second and end up being vice president. And if I lose, I'll be happy because I'll be able to retire to Quincy with you, Abigail. So he still maintains the Cincinnati posture you described.
He said that Jefferson's ambition was monumental and that Jefferson was at least deluding himself. How do you see that?
I think he says that after the election of 1800, when he's pretty hostile. He doesn't tend to say that at the time. The person he thinks is most ambitious is Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, and he accuses them of the kind of unbridled ambition. He never accused Jefferson of that. He recognized that Jefferson was sincere like him. Public service was a sacrifice. It wasn't supposed to be a job. It was a commitment to the public that was going to cost you. And Jefferson himself said, no man exits this office with the same reputation that he enters it. They both didn't view the presidency as a plum to end their careers.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break, but we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're joined this week by Professor Joseph Ellis and the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And Joe, if I might, I'd like to refer to your book, American Sphinx. There's a section that you title Words and Music, which I thought was just perfect. And you write, although an obsession by definition does not need any urging, in Jefferson's case, a good deal of looking back occurred at the urging, one might even say the frantic insistence of John Adams. The resumption of correspondence between the two patriarchs seems, in retrospect, almost inevitable. But it really wasn't inevitable, was it, sir?
No, it wasn't. I mean, and when you say the past, looking back at the past, when he uses the word the past, he always said the dead hand of the past. Notice when he writes his achievements on his tombstone, he doesn't even list the presidency. And also notice that in this very conversation we're having, we're in some sense violating one of Jefferson's cardinal principles, namely that he's hostile to all forms of a legacy. That is, we shouldn't be trying to figure out what to do about this quarantine by referring to Jefferson. He's opposed, his central legacy is to be opposed to all legacies. Every generation is sovereign and needs to figure it out for themselves. That's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's a good way of beginning to think about how they talk to each other in their retirement years.
Well, there was a lot of resentment on Adams' part. In fact, that same section you go on to talk about that. You talk about him spending 12 years groveling and grimacing and twitching away in barely suppressed resentment. And you quote one of his letters, Mr. Jefferson has reason to reflect upon himself. How he will get rid of his remorse in his retirement, I know not. He must know that he leaves the government infinitely worse than he found it, and that from his own error or ignorance. I wish his telescopes and mathematical instruments, however, may secure his felicity.
Right.
That's great.
He's writing that right as Jefferson's retired in 1808, 1809, and if you wanted, historians want to talk about Jefferson's presidency, it's tough to rank him because the first term is one of the greatest in American history, topped off by the Louisiana Purchase, the greatest executive action in American history. Gives us a third of the middle of the continent. Gives us the Dakotas, for God's sake.
Right.
On the other hand, the second term was a disaster because of the embargo that he created to avoid war with England. It wrecked the economy. It especially wrecked the New England economy. And Jefferson wanted to get out of he was so happy to get out of there and turn that whole mess over to Madison at the time. And so Jefferson is making that remark at that moment.
So we've established that it was pretty unlikely that this reconciliation, that it was even going to happen. And we've also established that Adams held a lot of resentment towards Jefferson. Can the two of you help our listeners, give them a timeline, how this finally came to be?
Well, first of all, they both felt something unresolved here, that Jefferson truly was a generous man who loved friendship, had deep admiration for John Adams personally, if not always for his policies. And he had to feel chagrin that things had fallen apart in so dramatic a way. And Adams was an even more effusive human being who loved in a way that I don't think Jefferson was capable of. And he loved Thomas Jefferson. So they're stewing at different parts of the United States in the post-presidential period of Jefferson. And it seems to me clear, Joe, that Jefferson himself would never have been able to make the first move, that just wasn't part of his character set. But a number of people intervened. Edward Coles, who was a young Virginian who admired them both, but mostly Dr. Rush, Benjamin Rush, actually had a dream. He's the father of American dream psychology, and he says he had an actual dream in which the North Pole and the South Pole of the American Revolution, i.e., Adams and Jefferson, reconciled, and as Joe has already said, would die about the same time. And he worked hard. He made a campaign of it to convince each one that it was time. And several times they got close and fell back. And then finally, on January 1st, 1812, Adams picked up his pen. Does that square with your view of it, Joe?
Yeah, it does. And, Jefferson didn't want to. I mean, Adams sort of said, "I'll be interested in establishing a correspondence if he goes first." I mean, and if Jefferson goes first.
But didn't Abigail Adams really go first? Isn't she the catalyst for all of this?
Yes, she did. There was a correspondence with Jefferson in 1804. Is it right, Clay?
Yes, May and June of 1804.
Yeah, they're in the letters that are bound together, and that's Lester Cappin's edition. And all real history buffs who really want to have a classic document in their library should get it. It's available in paperback on Amazon. The correspondence. Lester Cappin is the editor, UNC Press. But that in that exchange, Jefferson and Abigail Adams wrote Jefferson when his daughter died, his second daughter, Maria, and because she knew Maria and she wanted to console Jefferson. And in the response, Jefferson thought it was an overture from the whole Adams family to resume the correspondence and perhaps even the friendship. That wasn't really Abigail's intention, and they get into it. She writes him some pretty nasty letters, basically calling him a liar and the person who's vilified her husband and her son. But so it's not an entry into the correspondence. It's almost something that's going to have to be overcome. Once Adams starts to think this might be something he wants to do, he starts saying things like, well, people say, how can you possibly correspond with that man, your bitter enemy? He says, what do you mean bitter enemy? We never disagreed about anything. The only thing I can remember we disagreed about was the length of hair. He wanted it cut short, I wanted it long, or maybe it was the other way around. Or it's like a sailor who hasn't seen an old sailor in 30 years and comes upon him and says, how fare you, Jack? So he's playing down the history of their tension and opposition in order to get himself ready psychologically. And then the famous line that Clay's used on many occasions, and it's a wonderful line. He says, you and I ought not to die until we have explained ourselves to each other. And in that sense, they really do see themselves as the two poles of the revolutionary generation, and they see the correspondence as a way of recovering a dialogue that's really, I think, the central dialogue in American history.
That famous letter that John Adams wrote was July 15th, 1813. So a year and a half into the renewed correspondence. And he closes the letter about a whole range of subjects when he's calling into doubt the very idea of enlightenment, ideas of progress, and the amelioration of the condition of mankind. But at the end of that letter, John Adams does say, you and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other. And then he promises to start in on the next letter on the question of religion. I just think that's as profoundly beautiful as anything
I do
that
too.
could have been written.
Their temperaments are fundamentally different here, and that's what makes it so interesting. I mean, Jefferson didn't like argument. Jefferson thought argument was a dissonant noise that disturbed the serenities. Adams thought that argument was the highest form of conversation. And he said, I can't wait till we get to heaven so I can argue with you and Benjamin Franklin about the meaning of the revolution. I mean, what's this crap about, this Christian crap about the beatific vision? How boring. Anyway, yes, they're ready to go now. And I think the proper visual image to have about the correspondence is Jefferson standing in the center of the room, his arms folded across his chest, watching Adams pace back and forth in front of him, talking endlessly, periodically stopping to grab Jefferson by the lapel and say, now, what do you think of that? Especially when Napoleon has just lost at the Battle of Waterloo, and he says, see, I was right. The French Revolution is a failure. England is the future in Europe, not France, blah, blah, blah. So that it's, and he loves that. Adams loves it. He writes 2 letters for every one. That correspondence is more important to Adams than it is to Jefferson, who's got other things to do, like found the University of Virginia. The Adams temperament, you either love him or hate him because he is irascible, he's vain, but he's also just, as I say, the passionate soul. And And I can't choosing between Adams and Jefferson is I say like choosing between the words and the music of the American Revolution.
But Joe, I certainly love your metaphor of Jefferson with his arms folded serenely while Adams struts around and puts one challenge after the next to Jefferson. I see it in another way. I see Jefferson as Muhammad Ali and Zaire, while George Foreman pummels him and Ali plays rope-a-dope. Let me just quote one sentence that you both will find wonderful. This is from July 3rd, 1813. So again, that same summer, 18 months into the correspondence. And here's what Adams says to his old friend: "Your character in history may easily be foreseen. Your administration will be quoted by philosophers as a model of profound wisdom, but by politicians as weak, superficial, and short-sighted." No one wants that letter, Joe.
Yeah, and I think that Adams's strategy, and it's not a strategy because it's not conscious on his part, but he can't help himself but raise difficult matters. If Jefferson had been able to control the correspondence, it would have never touched upon the things that we find most interesting now.
Exactly.
And it's Adams that pushes the agenda into questions of disagreement, fundamental disagreement about what these are the two of the greatest founders. No question about that. And they don't think they've done what one thinks they've achieved one thing and one thinks something quite different.
And Jefferson is still an idealist, although a sobered one, and Adams is not. Adams borders on a cynic at times in this correspondence. Adams wants to pick fights. He has scores to settle. He's mad at Jefferson still. And here's my question to you. So it's a near miss thing that they even start this correspondence. Adams is the bigger man. He writes the first very tentative and quite stiff little note. Jefferson replies carefully. Then they start to really maybe relax a little. But both of them have to be thinking, we don't want this to end abruptly and badly, that we have to really be careful here not to spoil this and have this be a confirmation of the dispute rather than a reconciliation of it. So Jefferson, as you know, is just an exquisitely polite man, at least to your face. And so he's trying very hard in the correspondence to be agreeable. Every time he says anything that could be construed as a criticism of Adams, he pulls back and says, but what do I know? Time has passed. We disagree as rational friends. These things are not personal and so on. Adams is also concerned because if Jefferson stops writing to him, that's a disaster for John Adams. But for some reason, his character is such that he cannot not jab at Jefferson about the issues that remain.
Yeah, the Adams view of this would be Jefferson tells you what you want to believe, and I'm going to tell you what you really need to know. And it is between an idealist and a realist here. It's about the future values of what we call the Enlightenment. And I think that they're both, however, as you are suggesting, Clay, fundamentally aware of the fact that we're going to be reading these letters 230 years later. They're writing to us as well as to each other. They're writing for posterity, and both care deeply about how they're remembered. Now, how they're remembered, neither one of them wants to be canonized. Both of them have profound things to say about thinking of the revolutionary generation as somehow divinely inspired. The tongues of fire appeared over their heads when they were negotiating the Declaration or the Constitution. That's all wrong. We were all imperfect human beings doing the best we could, but we achieved something that's distinctive and that might very well be the model for Republican government for the world. And we want posterity to know that. Then both of them want posterity, meaning us, to know that.
They also share a view. We have the kind of silly notion that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. What they've both discovered is that they agree on more things than they thought. And they have a mutual, deep antagonism to the stock jobbers, the bankers, the commercial interests, the Hamiltonians, the high Federalists, that both of them are disgusted with the Federalist program, and particularly the high-handedness of federalism. And so this allows them to move back towards each other, because they have that one other thing that they really both mutually decry in American life.
I think that's right. I mean, John Quincy Adams' son, he gets elected president, but he is defying the values of the Federalist Party, and he's destined to be a one-term president like his father, because he believes that the collective interest of the whole has to take precedence over all these other interest groups, including these economic interest groups that are emerging in Jacksonian America. They agree about more than they disagree, but I think Adams understood the following point, and Jefferson never quite did. Adams had to, in a way, and it's this: that the revolution isn't complete until they're together. And maybe by together reach some sort of rapprochement, that they are the two sides, and one side needs the other. It's a dialogue, and there's a lot of different ways to describe the dialogue, and I'm about to describe it in an Adamite way, and so you can correct it, Clay, and give it a Jeffersonian. And reject it. But it's really an argument whether government is us or them. Adams believes it's us. That's the reason he thinks that he gave the name Commonwealth to Massachusetts, not state. And Pennsylvania and Virginia and Kentucky copied that, and they're all commonwealths. And I mean, it's a point of some significance in the moment we're talking right now. All together. Jefferson believes that sovereignty resides in the individual, and he doesn't see any role for government except getting out of the way. And if it gets out of the way, we'll be fine. People will interact in a way that leads to the pursuit of happiness for most Americans. Adams never believed that. In some ways, Adams is aware of things that are going to happen only intuitively. He's aware of Darwin. He's aware of Freud. He's aware of, the human nature that Adams foresees is a human nature that can commit the sins of the Holocaust. He believes that the Enlightenment is a set of illusions about human beings. And if you create a government based on the assumption that majorities are always enlightened, that you're destined to be disappointed.
Yes. Jefferson either believes or lets himself believe that he believes that man is good, that we're capable of indefinite perfectibility, that the bromides of the Enlightenment are true, that we're up to the challenge of self-government. And if we could just get formal institutions like government out of the way and liberate the natural creativity and goodness of man, that utopia or near utopia would blossom forth. And when we talk about this, when David and I talk about this on the Jefferson Hour, I always quote Adams anachronistically as saying, "Have you looked around, Mr. Jefferson? have you really studied? Have you looked at Burr? Have you looked at Hamilton? Have you looked at Patrick Henry? Have you even looked at George Washington? Do you really have any sense of observation of how the world
really
works?"
Have you walked out into your fields in Monticello and took a look at 200 slaves?
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break from this conversation, but I'm anxious to return to it. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we're so pleased to be joined by Professor Joseph Ellis. And Mr. Ellis, Joe, if I might, I have a question about, I want to go back to the Abigail Adams letter, because I reread it this morning before we had this conversation. I'm just astounded by it.
Tell me why you're astounded. What was astounding to you?
Mostly the way that she would write Jefferson in such a full frontal attack on him. And she used his own words. In fact, she quoted his letter in hers. She quotes Jefferson as saying, "There's only one thing that Adams ever did that really made me angry, and that was the midnight appointments." But she answers that and says that really this was a precedent that was established by Washington, so it was golden, and in fact that these men were appointed before anybody even knew that Jefferson was going to be president, which kind of deflates Jefferson's argument. And I've been thinking about that and trying to understand, was this something that Jefferson was holding on to as an excuse to be angry, or was he justified in using that as a reason to be angry? Tell me what you think.
I think he was genuinely angry with the fact that he had to deal with this guy called John Marshall for his entire presidency. And that Jefferson really feared Marshall. Marshall was related to him indirectly through the Lee family. And Marshall was the central Federalist mind that insisted that the federal government was sovereign over the states, and that this was the fundamental repudiation of Jefferson's belief in state sovereignty. And Jefferson called Marshall the great Buddha, who's just sitting up there in the Supreme Court, and we can't do anything about him. And he used to say to people, if you ever have a conversation with Marshall, be very careful, because whatever you say, he will take it and he will twist it. He described Marshall's reasoning process as twistifications, and it will end up in a place that you didn't intend. Marshall had also written a 4-volume biography of Washington that's a repudiation of the entire Jeffersonian legacy, so that his hostility towards Marshall was somewhat transferred to Adams, who says, well, he's the guy who made this happen. But the hostility was real. It was somewhat misplaced, as Abigail was trying to tell him.
What about her argument, and then I'll let it go, that these appointments were made prior to even knowing that Jefferson was going to be president?
That's right. But remember, in our own time, Mitch McConnell did exactly what Jefferson said should be done.
Good point.
He refused to appoint Obama's nominee, Garland, to the Supreme Court 9 months before the election, in fact. Now, I think that's a perversion of the Constitution myself, but we're still living with the argument that they're having.
Thanks for settling that for me.
Just a quick thought about that, Joe and David. So Abigail Adams was reading the Constitution correctly, that John Adams was president up until March 4th, 1801, that he had constitutional rights and responsibilities to fill vacancies during that time. As a courtesy, he might have wanted to defer the next appointment to his successor. He certainly would be more likely to have done that if his next successor was a Federalist like himself. But Abigail was right and Jefferson was wrong. On the other hand, I think you'll agree, Joe, that the appointment of John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, where he served for 34 years, was one of the most consequential decisions in American history.
I think so, too. I think that Adams's greatest contributions to American history are the people he appoints. He appoints Washington, nominates Washington to become head of the Continental Army, and then Marshall, who's the greatest Chief Justice in American history. He also, you might say, he's the guy. I mean, there's controversy about this, but he also is the guy who tells Jefferson to be the one to write the Declaration of Independence, or refuses to do so, and Jefferson is the choice. So yeah, but I think that Abigail didn't hate Jefferson in the moment that they're all referring to back after the election, but before the inauguration. She invites Jefferson to the White House. We didn't call it. It wasn't called the White House yet. That didn't happen until much, much later. But that went to dinner with members of Congress who are in the process of voting on whether or not Jefferson or Aaron Burr should be made president. Because remember, it's a tie. and it's going to the House as the Constitution stipulates, and every state gets one vote in the House. Jefferson doesn't know the guys who are making the vote, and so Abigail goes around and introduces them to all these people, and then comes back and says, "These are people you need to get in touch with these people, because these are the people who are going to decide your fate." So she's trying to help him at that moment, and still retains affection for him, and in the end, as much as John says that their friendship is more important than anything else.
Joe, last week when we talked with you about this relationship, and David brought up the question of that famous exchange between Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson in the early summer of 1804 after the death of his daughter Maria, you said, and I think you're right, that nobody, and we mean nobody, ever wrote to Jefferson as harshly as she did.
Yeah, and he loved her. I mean, she was always somewhat of a mystery to him, because in Jefferson's world, women were supposed to sort of be people that stood aside and took care of the knitting or the sewing, and their education should be in music rather than in the classics. He was somewhat taken aback by the Salon set in France, by the women's role there. But Abigail could stand astride both traditions. She was a woman who took her role as a wife and mother very seriously, but she was also extremely well-read and extremely independent and intelligent. And he sort of loved that. He loved that combination. He didn't see I don't think he ever saw another woman who was like her.
But in contrast, Adams, he wrote about Mercy Warren.
Mercy Otis Warren, yeah.
Right, and he wrote about her and how intimidated he was of her because she was this strong woman character. And that really struck me because he married one.
Who, John?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, but they recognized, I mean, if you go back to I've written a book on this called First Family, Abigail and John. And so I'm brimming over with too many facts, I guess. But when they were courting, their banter was what they loved about each other. She would give him a hard time. He would love that. And yet she was the ballast, the psychological and emotional balance that he needed in order to become a great man. And he recognized that. He once said, I'm going to preserve all my letters. This was in 1776, and you need to do the same thing because I think your letters are better than mine. And, he might be right.
That's great.
Joe, I want to read, for both of you, David and Joe, I want to read to you something that Abigail Adams wrote in a letter to Jefferson after the death of her daughter, Abigail Jr., Nabby. Abby died a horrific death of breast cancer. She had a mastectomy without the kind of medical procedures that we count on today, including anesthesia. Just a horrific operation. It was only a temporary solution. The cancer metastasized, and she died in a really horrific death. And Abigail Adams takes the time now to write another letter to Jefferson about loss because she's remembering her gesture back in 1804 when Jefferson's daughter died. But at the end of her letter, Joe, I want you to listen to this, both of you. This is the last paragraph. But although time has changed the outward form, she's talking about how she doesn't look the way she did before all of these sorrows. Mm-hmm. But although time has changed the outward form and political back-wounding calumny for a period interrupted the friendly intercourse and harmony which subsisted, it is again renewed, purified from the dross. So she's not really over it yet.
No, but she's attributing the disagreement. I mean, the disagreements are played up by the press, and both of them are in a mood in their elderly years now. Both John and Jefferson and Abigail to look back and say that the partisanship that we lived through prevented us from remembering what's most important. And the death of a child brings you back to that elemental kind of emotional attachment. And that those are the important things. And we now see them more clearly than we did at the time.
Joe, if I may, I want to turn your attention to a letter of June 1813. This is one of the great letters from Adams to Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson had made the mistake a little bit earlier of saying that he had lived through the terrorism of the time, by which he meant, political pamphleteering and assaults in the press. But John Adams took terrorism in a very different sense. And he talks about what Philadelphia in 1793 during the sort of the Americanization of the French Revolution. And he says that 10,000 Philadelphians were marching in the streets, threatening to pull Washington out of his house to impeach him, or maybe worse, that Adams himself had weapons brought to his back door so that he could defend his life if he were attacked by armed mobs. And he says that this is amazing considering the pandemic that we're now in. I'm quoting now. He says, nothing but the yellow fever of 1793, which removed, and then he mentioned several of the incendiaries, could have saved the United States from a total revolution of government.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, isn't that?
It is. And he's factually correct. And he's again, it goes back to the underlying assumptions of the French Revolution versus the American Revolution. And that the notion that you can trust the people to do the right thing all the time or most of the time is an illusion in Adams's view, and that he's reminding Jefferson that this was, in France, they're cutting up people's heads off and rolling them down the streets. And Jefferson's letter, which you in an earlier conversation with me called attention to, it's called the Adam and Eve letter, says to his secretary, William Short, if in fact it means these kind of guillotine and these heads rolling is necessary, it's still worth it.
There were one Adam and one Eve alive in every nation and alive free. That's
right. That's right. Well, that's a wow. That's Maoist, man. I mean, that it's that or maybe Stalin-esque in terms of in order to. Well, I guess Mao's view is in order to you have to break eggs to make a revolution, and
that's a lot of eggs. One Adam and one Eve. In the same letter, Joe.
That's right. That's true.
Jefferson, but as a historian, you're a historian.
That's what they
Adams
say.
is surely exaggerating when he says there were 10,000 people in a mob outside his quarters in Philadelphia.
I thought that too, Clay. But when I've been working on a book now on the 1770s, and the size of crowds are much larger than I realized. Like before the Tea Party, they're having a meeting in the church in Boston, and there are like 12,000 people there. I don't know how that can be. So that, I mean, Philadelphia. I guess it's Philadelphia as the capital at that time. It's the largest city, although it's hardly what we would now call a metropolis. But he might have been exaggerating, but not by much.
Well, was he exaggerating the threat to Washington's life and his own?
I think so. Yes. I mean, there were riots in England right in the 1780s called the Gordon Riots, where the king was never threatened, but the prime minister and the other people were, and their houses were destroyed. And remember, they're thinking too about their own behavior towards Tories during the run up to the Revolution, and they didn't kill many of them, but they destroyed their houses and burned their libraries, and so that once you release that kind of popular movement, you can't control it. That's Adams's real point. And the French Revolution is the classic example of what happens when you do that. It's part of their disagreement about whether the principles of the American Revolution are transferable to other countries. And the main one is France, but that at one point in the correspondence, a little bit later, they get into this argument, and Adams says the revolution can never happen in Latin America because those countries were created by Catholic hierarchy countries that don't possess the same value system that we do. And I mean, they would think that the notion you're going to be able to establish Jeffersonian democracy in the sands of Iraq and Afghanistan as a complete illusion.
And it's one of the reasons why maybe a Confucian-based society like China and South Korea is more capable of performing collectively against this quarantine than we are.
So this letter to Jefferson from Adams, I just want to quote this most famous passage. So he's just said, the yellow fever alone is probably what saved us from a complete revolution. There were 10,000 people in these mobs that I actually had to sequester arms through my back door. And my servants wanted to run out and fight these mobs, but I had to hold them back and so on. Something of an exaggeration, I believe. But then he concludes with this famous passage, Joe, and I want you to explicate it for us. So, Joe, this is what Adams concludes. I have no doubt you was fast asleep in philosophic tranquility, Mr. Jefferson. Tell us what that means.
It means that Jefferson's comfortable with violence if he's pretty far away from it. And that in the same way he viewed the insurrection in Massachusetts in 1786 as something that was a good thing. And that, you know, the tree of liberty must periodically be watered by the blood of human beings. That your view of this is possible because you levitate above it, and it's never directly something you have to face.
Gentlemen, we are out of time for this week's conversation, although I must say we have 3 more conversations on the Adams-Jefferson correspondence scheduled with Professor Joseph Ellis and the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Sadly, the 3 of us couldn't be in the same room to record this conversation, owing to the times we're living in. And on that note, we must once again thank those that are keeping our lives in some semblance of normality, particularly those on the front line, the healthcare workers. I have such admiration for them. And with that, sir.
Thanks, everyone. You're listening to a very special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll see you next week for another conversation with the eminent historian, Dr. Joseph Ellis. Thanks for listening.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.